Hello, I'm Charles Mallet with a UK column interview, and today I have with me Brad Miller, who is formerly a Lieutenant Colonel in the US Army, having had a battalion command in the 101st Airborne Division, and also, most notably, the author of the Declaration of Military Accountability. Brad, a very warm welcome to UK column. Thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Charles. I really appreciate you reaching out. I'm happy to dig into some of these topics here, and I think we're going to have an interesting discussion. I will make one tiny modification to what you said in the intro there. I am one of a group of authors of the Declaration of Military Accountability, not the principal author, but definitely one of the individuals who was key in helping to promote it and get it out there. If I had to name one person who was the primary author, I would actually point to Rob Green, who is actually still serving as an officer in the United States Navy. But Rob and I worked together quite a bit on kind of propagating the message out there. But I do just want to make that one tiny correction. I would just not want to misrepresent the role that I had in crafting the declaration.
That is a very critical clarification. Thank you very much indeed, Brad. That's great, because when we do come to talk about that, it does already demonstrate that you were not acting on your own as some fringe lunatic, that this was
Right.
this was something that a lot of people were thinking about and taking seriously. Now, I introduced you as a former military man. In fact, your facial hair at the moment would absolutely qualify you for pretty much any rank in the British Army these days. But let's get some of the sort of military history out of the way, because I think people have a tendency to think, okay, here we go. Somebody else who was embedded really for nearly 20 years in the sort of, the state's architecture. Why do we want to be listening to him? Just tell us a little bit about your career. And I think for most people who've served, it's sort of characterized by the interspersement of high highs and low lows. Just give us a bit of an insight.
Sure. So I graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point. I graduated in 2003. I would go on to serve a little over 19 years on active service, and ended up resigning from the military in late 2022. My last day of active service was September 15th, 2022. And ultimately, I resigned before reaching that critical juncture of 20 years. 20 years is the mark in the United States military at which you can qualify for your retirement pension. So it's a pretty significant mark on the wall. And the reason that I resigned about 8.5 months shy of that mark is that I got to the point in which I realized that that I could no longer reconcile the way in which I viewed our government, our Constitution, the oath that I had taken as a military officer to support and defend the Constitution with military service. Now, on the outset, a lot of people are going to look at that and find that quite paradoxical, that you as a military officer who had taken an oath to the Constitution in your capacity as a military officer, you're saying you can't reconcile continued service in the military with that oath. But that is in fact the seemingly paradoxical situation that I found myself in. Now, that issue in and of itself is quite large, but the occasion that brought me to that realization was the COVID shot mandate. So in the summer of 2021, the Pentagon mandated that all service members would take the COVID shot. Now, by the summer of 2021, I was extremely resolute in my own mind that I was not going to take the shot. And sure, that was a decision that was partially about my own health. That's true. But I also felt that there were bigger issues at hand. I was a commander of a battalion at the time, which meant that once this mandate came down, that in my command capacity, I would then have to order others to take the shot as well. But even in a much larger, if we look through a much larger aperture than even that, I just felt that we had been lied the entire time about COVID, what it was or wasn't. A lot of narratives had clearly been spun a year and a half into this madness that we all experienced in 2020 and the first half of 2021. So by the time that we got to the late summer of 2021, there was just no way that I was going to go along with this. Like I say, one, because I didn't trust the shots just from a safety or an efficacy standpoint. But even that issue aside, I was just not going to be part of something that I felt was much larger, much more tyrannical than even the issue of the shot, which even on its face is already quite tyrannical.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's putting it putting it rather diplomatically. But let's just go to that. I mean, there's a lot that we want to talk about from there. But you were thinking that and making that decision in command of a battalion.
Mm-hmm.
What was the feeling leading up to that? So when the balloon went up, in effect, in sort of early 2020, and the world appeared to go completely mad,
Yeah.
what were your subordinates and your superiors thinking, as far as you could work out?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, so I was in 2020. I was not yet in command. I was actually stationed in Korea in 2020. I left Korea. I finished my tour there. I returned to the States in the summer of 2020. By this time, most of the world had kind of gone mad with the COVID response measures. The United States military was not unique in that regard, but we had not gotten to the point of the shot mandate yet. And in fact, in the summer of 2020, Operation Warp Speed would have been in full swing, but the shots would not be distributed until the end of the year. I think the first shots were distributed about December of 2020. But I returned to the States in the summer of 2020. I attended a course in Kansas from the summer of 2020 until the summer of 2021. And then in the summer of 2021, I moved from Kansas to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, which is the home of the storied 101st Airborne Division. And I assumed command of my battalion. And I was an engineer officer, so it was a combat engineer battalion. But I assumed command of that battalion on June 10th of 2021. The mandate would go into effect on August 24th, so about 2.5 months later. So to answer your question more specifically, in the beginning, I would say, and I was not necessarily unique in this regard, we were all kind of bombarded with whatever this was. It was all over the news, and I didn't know what to make of it either. But by that time, by 2020, I had long been skeptical of narratives that we would hear. I had long been skeptical of my own government's involvements in operations around the world. I had, by 2020, I had been looking into the issue of 9/11 for well over a decade by that point. I had started looking in that as early as 2007. And in fact, that had almost led me to leave the Army around 2008 or 2009. I did not. But then fast forward a decade or a little bit more than a decade later, a decade older, a decade more of just doing research into kind of how the world really works. And I was extremely skeptical of what we were being told, but I still didn't necessarily know what the truth was. So then you fast forward to the summer of 2021, and I will tell you that I felt quite lonely. To be a lieutenant colonel who was a battalion commander who had newly taken command, I knew right away that I was not on the team. I think this is something that you'll certainly understand just from your own background in the military, and anybody else who comes from a military background. You know, if you are a battalion commander, you are very much expected to be on the team of your brigade commander, your division commander. So when an unpopular mandate comes down, some would say that you have a professional duty to make sure that your subordinates kind of get in line with that mandate, regardless of how popular or unpopular it may be. And on the one hand, I can understand that. However, on the other hand, we also have a duty to our subordinates to, one, first and foremost, ensure that we are making good on the oath that we have taken to support and defend the Constitution. I think the mandate was wildly outside of the parameters of that duty. I also think that the mandate was unequivocally unlawful on its face. And again, we expect commanders, the mantle of command is something that should be taken extremely seriously. And so I, at some point, just realized this is the decision that is going to characterize my command. It's not going to come down to my tactical acumen. It's not even going to necessarily come down to the way in which I might have dispensed what we refer to as the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Obviously, you have a lot of authorities that are vested in you as a commander, but that's not how my command is going to be characterized. It's going to be characterized by this one decision about do I or do I not support the mandate. And ultimately, I made it very clear, even before the mandate went into effect, which I said was about 2.5 months after I took command. I made it very clear to my immediate superior, the brigade commander, and my superior 2 levels up, the division commander, that I was not going to take the shot even once it was mandated. And then once the mandate went into effect, I reiterated my steadfastness that I would not go along with it.
Right. My immediate response is good for you, and where was everybody else? But Brad, this is really serious stuff, and I think for anyone who's been listening so far, thinking that this is perhaps slightly to one side of being relevant because they don't have a military background, or because they don't necessarily see how important what was going on within the military, in fact, in many militaries, not just yours. What I would say to anyone who's having that thought is actually this, exactly what you've described, was seen across the board. In effect, the shifting completely of the moral goalposts. So what you've just described is taking an action born of a thought process for the preservation of your subordinates, those under your care. And had it been an issue relating to almost anything else, then I would contend that you would have been given a fair hearing. Is that a sort of,
Yes.
approximately the right view of things to take? Is that the way you see it? 'Cause, I mean, certainly this side of the Atlantic, everything went crazy, and it was because it had this sort of bizarre shield of protection. It's a vaccine, therefore everything is different.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we kind of collectively lost our minds, and that was not uniquely an American phenomenon. It was like that all over the world, right? And now we look back on it and we realize this was deliberate, this was planned, this was a well coordinated and executed event. We can certainly talk about that, but at the time, you kind of mentioned a moment ago, where was everybody else? Well, I'll attempt to answer that question quickly before I go on to what you just recently asked, and that is, to give you some perspective, I don't exactly know how many battalion commanders there are in the active duty U.S. Army, but I mean it's hundreds, and there were only 2 active duty battalion commanders in the Army that refused, to the extent that they were relieved of command, so that they refused to comply with the orders associated with the mandate without relenting. And to the credit of those above me, I mean, I was given an opportunity to kind of, come to my senses, as it were, because my brigade commander, I mean, I think he genuinely liked me. I mean, I think he understood my resolve, but he really hoped that it would not come to this. I mean, he told me that. Ultimately, it did, but yeah, I felt very lonely because, I mean, I remember thinking to myself, at the expense of and again, this is not about me. It's just I know my own situation, and explaining my situation and how this situation happened with me. I know that in some regard, I'm speaking for what happened to a lot of other people, even if they weren't necessarily in the military, but very similar situations happen with other people in other institutions. But I remember just thinking to myself, I'm looking to my left and my right, and I don't see anybody standing next to me, at least not kind of at my rank, at my level. There were younger service members that did refuse the shot. They didn't quite maybe have the same notoriety associated with their decisions, just because of my rank and my position. That said, I look at some of these junior service members that had, I don't know, maybe I had as many years in service as they were old, and I look at how some of these 18, 19, 20-year-old privates stood up against the behemoth that is the U.S. military, and I think that was, far more courageous than maybe what I had to do. But there is this issue of, and this is certainly something that service members understand, and that maybe those who have never served may understand, but there may be some ways in which maybe they get lost a little bit in this line of thinking, and that is, yes, the military is an orders-based institution, and yes, you must follow orders, and yes, you must follow the orders that you do not like. And in fact, you may even have to find orders that you think are unsound. Now, we all like to think that if you're given an order that you disagree with for whatever reason, tactical reasons or otherwise, that conditions may permit that you approach the issuing authority, typically a higher commander, and you discuss your issues with that order for reasons A, B, or C. Conditions permitting. There may not always be time, or there may be other commissions that preclude your ability to do that. But where that is possible, generally speaking, you can do that. You can go and approach a higher commander and say, "Sir, I think I understand your order, but I see this potential issue here, here, and here." And you may be told, "Hey, you know what? You're right. Thanks for bringing that to my attention." Or you may be told, "Hey, there are other things that you don't necessarily understand." Or you may be told, "Hey, got it. Go execute the order as given." And generally, that would mean that you have reached what we would refer to as the salute point, where you salute and you carry out that order. You have made your issues known. The order still stands, and you execute the order. Now, all of that kind of changes when we talk about orders that are unlawful. And this is something that the U.S. military, ostensibly on its face, does a very good job of educating even its most junior service members of. They are taught very early on, you do not have an obligation to follow unlawful orders. And in fact, you have an obligation to disobey those orders, or at least approach for clarification. Make sure you understand the order before you carry out something that you think is unlawful. So this is something that was understood. This is something that cadets at West Point are taught, that junior service members are taught, that very young officers are meant to kind of assimilate in their being in terms of understanding their conduct within the profession of arms. And yet somehow we discarded all of that because of COVID and the supposed emergency associated with it.
Okay, this is very good, because I think it's exposing people to the way in which the system works. A couple of things I want to come back to, which I think will lead into discussing the declaration of military accountability, because I think one of the issues at stake here is what we might describe as leadership, but really the sort of conditioning element of it. So let's just first talk about West Point. But just before I ask you the question, I just want to hold in mind the private soldiers that you're talking about, because there is this, and I think this was seen in the United Kingdom as well, not I don't mean necessarily inside the armed forces, but the man or woman who might be regarded as lesser educated and perhaps of a lower socioeconomic group did have, I would say, a greater tendency to realise what was going on and to resist. So just with that in mind, just describe from a West Point perspective how this is either a failure of leadership or indeed a success of the system. Which way should one regard it?
Yeah. West Point is regarded as a leadership laboratory. For the 4 years that I spent there, everything was geared towards you learning to become a leader and preparing specifically to be a platoon leader, because that is often seen as the first real role of leadership you will have as a very young lieutenant. And so everything you did, even your academic classes, everything was kind of oriented with that goal in mind. And a tremendous amount of effort and time was put into teaching about personal conduct, teaching about maybe working through moral dilemmas, or the honor code at West Point, which just simply states a cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. Even that, the lessons that are meant to be learned from that are supposed to shape your character so that you are prepared to lead America's sons and daughters in the crucible of combat, should you ever find yourself in that situation. So everything is oriented towards that. And so in some regards, I would say West Point takes that role very seriously, which on the one hand leaves you kind of scratching your head and asking yourself, well, how did West Point and how did the military writ large get this so wrong? Now, there's an interesting wrinkle to that, because you also asked, well, in some ways, can we look at this as almost like, ratification of the idea that the system works? And sadly, I think that we did see that the military has long been accused of indoctrinating its service members. Well, if you look at what happened during COVID, and you look at how common sense went out the window, and how individuals just became these orders following automatons, even when the orders seemed to be in real tension with the law, not some sort of invented conflict, but real palpable tension with the law. And yet the rigidity of the system unfortunately seemed to hold sway, and individuals sided with the institution over the law that institution is supposed to hold itself to.
Yes. Now, I think this leads us nicely into talking about the Declaration of Military Accountability, which I think I'm right in saying was published in January 2024. As I said when we were sort of getting in touch about sorting this out, I did cover this a couple of times on UK Column News, and it was very significant at the time. However, for those that either may not remember sufficient detail, just talk us through the process by which you even arrived at deciding upon doing such a thing.
Sure. And thank you for the coverage that you provided. I do appreciate that this received coverage outside of the United States. I think that's a testament to what it was that we did, and also just the fact that the message resonated with individuals, outside of the United States. So the Declaration of Military Accountability, or the DMA, is the brainchild of a good friend of mine, Rob Green. So Rob Green at the time was serving as a commander in the United States Navy. He is still serving in the United States Navy currently. And so he was the same rank as me before I resigned. I was a lieutenant colonel in the Army. He was a commander in the Navy. Both are 05s. And so Rob had written a book, and it's a fantastic book for anyone interested in this. And the book is called Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines. And it kind of details the story of the service member as he kind of confronts this issue. And he talks about the legal issues. He gives a lot of anecdotes from these service members and what they face as they were trying to navigate this issue. And it's a really fascinating book. So he published the book, and then he had this follow-on idea where he thought, we're not gaining as much traction as we should. We need to write an open letter to the American public. So he drafted some language. He sent it out to a small circle of friends. I was one of those individuals. We played with the language. We played with the draft. We shortened it just a little bit to get it to one page. Got it to where we thought it was ready to go. And then the idea was, let's send this out on New Year's Day of 2024. And so we came up with a plan as to how we were going to do that. So we decided that probably because I was already out of the military, and therefore, maybe it could be touched less easily by the military. So we decided that I would send it out. So the idea was, very early on the morning of January 1st, 2024, I would send an email first to senior leaders within the military. And I did that at exactly 4 a.m. Washington, D.C. time. I sent an email that had attached a copy of the declaration, and I sent it to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, other chiefs of staff, and a whole series of 3- and 4-star generals and admirals. And then and basically that email said, this is a letter that we have written to the American public. We are merely apprising you that this document is about ready to hit the streets. So and this is an important point, the declaration is not addressed to senior military officers. It is addressed to the American people and calls out what we would say are the crimes of the senior military officers against the rank and file, but then by extension, the American people. So that's kind of the characterization that I would give of what the Declaration of Military Accountability is. Nonetheless, kind of truth in lending here, we sent it first to these military officers, just basically letting them know this document's about to hit the streets. I sent that email. I turned right around. Of course, no one was answering that email at 4 a.m. on New Year's Day, but I turned right around then and posted it to Twitter, or now X. I think I posted it at 4:07, so just a couple minutes later, 4:07 a.m. Washington, D.C. time. Again, that was January 1st, 2024, so 2.5 years ago. But over that time, I believe that post has received about 5 million views, the overwhelming majority of which were within the first days and weeks. It caught immediate traction, resonated with a lot of people.
Okay, and just give a summary version of what the declaration actually contains.
Yeah, so it's interestingly enough, and I have to credit Rob with this. So he wrote it kind of in the voice of some of our founding documents. Principally probably the Declaration of Independence. So if you kind of read it in that voice, you will see that is somewhat mirrored in the Declaration of Military Accountability. But in essence, what it says is there have been a series of crimes perpetrated by senior military officers against the service members because of the COVID shot mandate, which is unlawful. And because 231 of us attached our names, we all signed the document. So we, the undersigned, are not going to stand by and allow these senior military officers to continue to get away with these crimes, and therefore we appeal to the American public for accountability, and we are just apprising these generals of that, but also appealing to the American people. And the idea there is that, okay, we live in a Republican system of governance. That means that we as the citizens have amazing responsibilities on our own shoulders because ultimately we are the stakeholders in this republic. And therefore, if we appeal to our representatives to no avail, and we appeal to other representatives to no avail, then ultimately we have to appeal to the highest authority, which in a republic is the people. So that's kind of the ultimate idea underpinning the Declaration of Military Accountability is we're now taking it to the people and letting them know that this cannot stand. And we named generals and admirals. I mean, we had them named in there, quite a few of them. But one of them was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that would have been in place at the time the mandate went into effect was General Mark Milley of the U.S. Army. He's one of individuals that is by name mentioned in the Declaration.
Okay, now before we get to the response, insofar as those who were on the distribution list are concerned, what about the media? How was that? I mean, I always said, UK column obviously covered this. You put it out on Twitter, but was this picked up at all by mainstream media?
Okay, yes and no. So it generated a lot of interest. And picked up significant interest, I would say, in the alternative media and some of the mainstream media that's kind of more on the fringe. So that's why I kind of say yes and no. Some of the major outlets, if they were more left-leaning, no, they were not going to pick it up. If they were more right-leaning, they might. And this is kind of tricky ground because I'm not one of these individuals that really looks at things within the left-right paradigm. That said, I think what we wrote was something that could be useful for those who operate within kind of that right half of that paradigm. I think we gave them something that was useful. This was actually a cause of immediate concern for me. So yeah, there were some mainstream outlets that did pick it up, did give it some attention, but in the more alternate media spaces, I would say it picked up a lot of attention.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you've hit it, the left-right thing. The reason I asked is because I was wondering how, in a way, it would be spun or how it would be probably tarnished by association to this, that. If there was any treatment of it that suggested that there was a very deliberate push for it to be sort of kicked into the long grass or marginalized.
Yeah, I think this is where so first of all, those of us who had a hand in either penning the document, I mean, really it was written by Rob, but then a small circle of us kind of helped edit the language a bit. And then there were 231 of us in total that signed it. So of the 231, all were either currently serving or were veterans. So particularly with those who were currently serving, I mean, we wanted to remain apolitical. We didn't want this to be about certain political personalities. However, when it got picked up, it could be easily used to kind of attack Biden or the Biden administration or the Secretary of Defense that was in charge of the Pentagon during the Biden administration, which was Lloyd Austin. Because, of course, Biden was the president when all this happened. Now, me personally, I've always seen that as something that we, and I'm kind of speaking for myself here because there are others within the DMA movement that have seen it a little bit differently. But for me, that was always a concern of mine because I don't necessarily want to reinforce that unhelpful dialectic of the left versus the right or the Republicans versus the Democrats, kind of this elephant versus donkey smokescreen, as I call it. And so I think that's where you have to be careful with our DMA, because I know the individuals who created it. I know that it was genuine in content, and that the individuals who wrote it and signed their names to it, potentially at great risk to themselves and their career, I know that they were 100% sincere in doing so. But I also know that if you're not careful, even something that is written totally sincerely can still be used as a tool to kind of reinforce, those unhelpful dialectical traps at times.
Okay, now what I absolutely want to know, what the audience will want to know is what sort of response came of it. But before we get to that, the question has to be asked: how the hell is Rob Green still in the Navy?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So, I give all the credit in the world to Rob Green because he was still serving when he did this. He put his name on it. Before this, he had already written a book that he had put his name on. He would not publish the book anonymously. And again, I would encourage people to go pick that book up. Again, it's called Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines. And just a fantastic book. But he refused to publish it anonymously. He put his name on it. And he's told me before that he had a conversation with his wife and he told her, if I end up, in military prison because of this, we're gonna have to figure out how you're gonna take care of the kids. With me being locked up, but I'm not going to shy away from this. So I give him all the credit in the world. His career has not been without significant obstacles, but he is still serving, and he, unlike me, and this is just a difference of perspective, there are some individuals that when they have been faced with what we've seen over the last couple of years, they have decided to fight from within the institution, whereas I made a very deliberate decision to fight from outside. Even when I was relieved of command, I was still inside the Army, and then I chose to resign. So those were two different sets of decisions that I made there. I didn't want to stay till 20. I didn't really want a pension from the government. I kind of would have considered it blood money. That's my decision. That's my perspective. There are others faced with a similar set of circumstances, made a different decision strategically for their own career and kind of, their place and the way that they wanted to kind of fight. And I don't necessarily judge anybody for the decision that they made. Rob's a great guy. There are plenty of others that have continued to try and fight from within. That just wasn't right for me. And I also maybe see the situation slightly differently than they do in terms of how bad things are, how far gone our institutions are. But I don't necessarily take anything away from anybody who wants to continue to try and fight from within.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, we'll come back to that later because I've got something that you've written that I will quote back at you. But before we do, let's just go to those military that were on that email list and those around them. I mean, what sort of response did come of it, or what are, even 2.5 years on, what effects are being felt from what you did on the 1st of January 2024?
Yeah, it was met with resounding strategic silence. And I think that was deliberate. It was the same way in which they had approached Rob's book, which is one of the reasons that I think he wasn't maybe punished more than he kind of was. His career was a bit marginalized for a while. But I mean, he was never locked up or anything like that. And I think it's because they made a deliberate decision. Don't go after his book. Don't try to discredit his book. I'm conjecturing here, but I do think a deliberate decision was made. Don't even touch the book, because even by trying to refute it, you're already lending it some credibility. Don't even touch it. And so I think when the DMA came out, which was very pointed towards them, I think a similar decision was made. But yeah, so no response initially from senior Pentagon officials. Now, clearly that would change a little bit. Towards the end of 2024, obviously we had our election, and then in January was the inauguration. And so the new administration came in, and at least on its face was going to try and correct some of the wrongs of the COVID shot mandate. I think the new Pentagon leadership and the new presidential administration has kind of misrepresented how much they've done to try and repair the wrongdoings associated with the mandate. But that is kind of the narrative, is that they are trying to correct everything that the previous administration did wrongly with the mandate.
No, okay. I think that sounds absolutely fair. I'm now going to read something that you wrote relatively recently, and I would like your comment on this, set against what it is that drives people to join the armed forces, perhaps the army in particular, and yet to consider some of the things that you were evidently thinking about for quite a lot of your career. So you wrote, "The United States military is a capital reallocation consolidation enterprise that operates at the behest of a powerful syndicate of bankers, asset managers, and investors that enrich themselves at the expense of everyday people around the world." Now, that's pretty damning, and yet I would wager that you treasure the memories that you had during your 19-year period, and that you served alongside some outstanding people, and I would imagine that you don't regret your service. Am I right?
Yeah, you are right. It's a complex issue, and I'm sure that you understand that, and others that are in our shoes as well. Those that have been in our boots probably understand it as well. Is how can I make a comment like that, which I wrote relatively recently? So how can I make a comment that is that damning, but then also kind of cherish my own service, or say, hey, I understand why people want to serve, and I understand why peers of mine are still in the service, even if I'm not. Now, when you read that, you can certainly understand why I'm no longer in service, and how, even though I've been approached to return, I have not seriously considered that, just because I feel like that the true root causes that drove me out of the military haven't really been addressed to a significant enough degree that I would consider going back. That's me. And I do stand by what I wrote there in terms of what the U.S. military has become. Now, many people who choose to don the uniform, that's not the frame that they have when they enter military service. It is certainly not the frame that I had when I went to West Point. It's not even the frame that I had when I graduated from West Point. It's not even the frame that I had when I went on my first deployment to Afghanistan. It's not even the frame that I had when I returned from my first deployment. It was something that I came to believe kind of after that, once I started doing my research, once I kind of started to put together my own picture of how the world operates, and what I think is the U.S. government's, and more specifically the U.S. military's role in kind of maintaining that global order.
Okay, so let's go therefore to the sort of the young, and this is the bit, I'd like this to really hit home with the sort of lifetime civilians, because we're talking, you and I have both served in different capacities. And I absolutely understand what you're talking about. I understand that language. I understand that apparent enormous paradox. But for many others, it's really not apparently clear. If you came across, and I dare say that you do, young man or woman, young men, young women, who are considering this as a career, what do you say? How do you deal with that these days?
Yeah, it's an enormously important question. And obviously it's one that I grappled with, and I made the decision to go into the military. So I certainly can understand why a young person today would look at the military as an option. So that I understand. Now, I have been saying for the last couple of years, and I will continue to say, that I cannot recommend military service at this time. And when I have broached this subject before, and the way that which I would approach it today, if I were sitting down with, an 18-year-old who's trying to decide what they want to do with their life, I would ask them, okay, well, what are your goals? What do you find attractive about the military? Is it the sense of camaraderie? Is it because you want to serve your nation? Is it because you need money for school and that's a route to be able to do that? And maybe that option wouldn't be open to you without military service. And then maybe just try and pull on those threads and see exactly what their goals are. And always when you're approaching a young person about this, my mentality is much different than it was, 30 years ago when I was thinking about, when I was first really considering the idea of going to West Point. But one of the reasons that I went to West Point is I don't know, maybe there's this sense of idealism or lyricism attached to it, but it was this love of country. I was always a big fan of history, and West Point is just almost like mythical and kind of its historical prominence, within the United States. So there may be other young people today who feel the same way. So, I don't want to crush anyone's dreams or whatever. And I don't necessarily want to tell a young person exactly what to do or not do. But what I would say is, here are some things to consider. Here are maybe some other ways in which you might be able to achieve your goals. And here are some potential pitfalls that you might not have considered that you may have to confront if you go into the military. Like something as simple as just the vaccine requirements, or have you considered maybe what drives why we go to war, where we go to war, when we go to war? And I understand that some of that stuff maybe, we don't expect 18-year-olds to necessarily be geopolitical experts, but I think there are ways in which we can kind of tease out some of those ideas. But here's the other thing. If someone were to tell me that they are going to join the military, maybe their dad and grandpa and great grandpa served, and they feel they have a moral and a family obligation to go, it's what they want to do, they've never seriously considered doing something else, then I would say, okay, I understand. If you serve, here's a little bit of guidance about how to do it, how to make some decisions ahead of time before you're ever confronted with some of these moral dilemmas, and how to maybe protect yourself. So make the decision before you ever put on the uniform as to what you believe is right and what you believe is wrong. Make the decision before you ever put on the uniform that you know why you're going to serve, why you're going to put on that uniform, and that you understand that it's not just about some sort of prestige associated with the uniform, that it's about your love of country and your love of your compatriots, your countrymen, your fellow Americans. That should also weigh in. But also understand what it means to be in a situation where you potentially may have to say no to a superior officer. Not because you don't like the order, not because it may even put you at risk. That's not necessarily a reason to disobey an order. But understand what is a legitimate reason to disobey an order, make that decision ahead of time, and just kind of know that if you're ever in that situation where you are confronted with something that you know is wrong, something that you know is immoral or unlawful, then just have the decision made ahead of time that you will not go along with it. That's some of the guidance that I would give a young person that is set on military service.
I think that would be very, very gratefully received by anyone that did hear it. And also, I should congratulate. I think you seem to have done a very thorough estimate before this interview, because I was going to go on to ask you exactly that question about how you would encourage people who are serving to think, and that's exactly what you've just done. But what that brings out, and this idea of love of country, of course, love of country is an incredible tool there for exploitation by nefarious actors, and I think we're seeing that absolutely across the piece at the minute, particularly under the banner of national security, which obviously has never gone away. I mean, for the United States, certainly for the United Kingdom, from the late 90s, particularly 25 years ago, national security was stamped on absolutely everything, and I think we're seeing a resurgence in that now. Just give us sort of an American perspective on how far down the route of national security people are being pressed insofar as what they're supposed to do in the name of it.
It is one of the chief, I would say, engines of narrative is national security, because, who doesn't care about the security of their nation, right? And we as human beings, and it's been like this since the beginning of time, right? We worry about threats, and we do some in everyday decisions, big or small. We do some sort of, even if it's a very rudimentary risk assessment. So I think on the one hand, we can understand that, and therefore we can understand how certain power complexes then can manipulate our emotions, and can manipulate what I would consider to be some of our most positive traits against us. And this is something that I think people have to understand. When we look at how the world operates and who these, shadowy global figures are, whomever they may be, wherever they may be, nothing seems to be beyond what they're willing to do, and therefore that means that they will certainly manipulate some of your most positive traits against you. Love of country is one of those. Love of your family is one of those. I mean, perhaps one of the most extreme, ridiculous examples of this is the whole idea that if you didn't take the COVID shot, you might put grandma at risk. You were a grandma killer. I mean, that is manipulating your love of your family against you, or your love of your community, your love of your countrymen. So national security is one of those things that gets right at the heart of our sense of self, but also one of the senses of collective that we also feel. If someone is threatening our country, the citizens of our country, then to some degree they are threatening us. So with Americans are particularly susceptible to this. I think just because of our own history, we've kind of over 250 years, we've really come to believe our own hype in some ways. And I'm not an America hater. I mean, we're getting ready to celebrate, the 250th anniversary of July 4th. I'm ready to celebrate. I love my country, but I am heavily critical of the government. There's a saying that I've always liked from the author Mark Twain, which says, patriotism means loving your country always and loving your government when it deserves it. And that resonates with me because I think we have to draw a stark contrast between country and government. They're not synonyms, they're not the same thing. And sometimes the best thing that you can do for your country, or to support your country, or express your love of country and your fellow citizens, is to rightly demarcate the authorities and limitations of government encroachment into our lives.
Yeah, I think your point, or bringing out Twain's quote, is most apposite, and in fact leads me on to talk about something else that absolutely has been wrapped up as national security, certainly in the United Kingdom and the United States as well, not least because of the extraordinary now convergence of the two militaries. But I want to ask you about Israel and the part that the state of Israel, the government, appears to play in the everyday lives of Americans who are paying their tax dollars into the military industrial complex in order that what? I mean, what is going on, and how is that being regarded by people that you're sort of in touch with?
Yeah, this is a topic that has rightly garnered a lot of attention over the last couple of months. And of course, we look at what's happening right now in and around Iran, but also just here domestically, some of these proposals that have come out recently for increased interoperability between the two militaries. And then we look at how it almost becomes hard to determine where, from a foreign policy perspective, where policy objectives from the Israeli perspective end and American ones begin, or vice versa. So I think Israel has... So I am not one of these individuals that believes that Israel controls the United States. I don't believe that the inverse is necessarily true either. I kind of look at it as there's clearly some sort of global, power complex that kind of controls both. And there are a lot of financial, military, and even technical and, dare I say, technocratic initiatives that are served by the governments of both. But militarily speaking, Israel clearly serves as an outpost for certain operational objectives within that region. Now, some of that on its surface is to be understood. You could say the same thing about South Korea in East Asia. that allows us to kind of project power just regionally. Now, is that good or is that bad or whatever? But that's certainly not unique to Israel. But the Israeli relationship with the United States is something that I think a lot of Americans are rightly uncomfortable with for a variety of reasons. One, the clear influence in U.S. policy and with U.S. policymakers that is very direct and highly outsized, given other countries that also we have a strong relationship with, right? But then also there's the religious slash ethnic levers that are pulled for reasons of influence, and they're used quite often. I'm a very strong critic of Zionism, but that is something that has obviously influenced American politics and still continues to influence American politics. But also, Israel has become a way in which the U.S. government can achieve certain objectives without having to do it itself, and therefore grant itself a screen of plausible deniability. And I would use as an example a lot of what has been going on in Gaza over the last couple of years. Another thing is that there are innovations, largely technical, but with military application, that are, I would say, kind of being, there are proofs of concept that are going on that Israel is conducting that I think will make their way back into the American military. And just some of the things that have been done in Gaza, particularly with the way in which AI and other tech initiatives have been used in their decision-making models or their targeting cycles, and the way in which AI has become a crucial part of those targeting cycles, I think is going to make its way back into the U.S. The U.S. is obviously already using AI systems, but I think the part that a lot of us kind of worry about is, okay, as you remove more and more of the human decision-making element from the way in which decisions are made as to what targets are going to be assigned, how effects are going to be delivered on that target, and then how like battle damage assessments are going to be done. What is the role of the human decision maker in that? And I think some of that is kind of already being proofed by the Israeli military in ways that I think will make their way back to Western militaries, but certainly, the American one.
Yeah, I think you put that very well insofar as not necessarily suggesting that either the United States controls Israel or Israel controls the United States, because in a way it's a bit of a false binary. The point of it is that, exactly like you say, the United States in effect is able to have that level of plausible deniability, but also of course there are an awful lot of people who are doing very well out of that situation. And exactly like I read out in the quote from your writing, this is driven in large part by enormous financial decision-making processes.
So our idea of the military-industrial complex, I think, does need to be updated. So this is a term, it's used very pervasively in the U.S. and has been for the last 6 decades because it was used by President Eisenhower as he was leaving office. Beware of the military-industrial complex. And that, for many decades, meant largely military hardware, these large corporations, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, that are who's building our munitions and who's building the computer systems, the computer systems that guide the munitions. What about our ships? Who build those? Who's going to build, tanks, etc. And I think if we take the same concept, but we update it, we realize that now the military-industrial complex is concerned about data, first and foremost right now. So there's this increasingly technical aspect of the military-industrial complex. So it's not so much that Raytheon and Lockheed Martin have become less important. They're still very important, but now it's Palantir, and of course that has to be the first one that I mentioned. But it's not the only one. There are other data collection and analysis corporations out there that are becoming increasingly sophisticated and increasingly more important in terms of their contracts that they have with the Pentagon.
Back in the day where the government, the Department of Defense, the Ministry of Defense, Department of War, whatever it is, would purchase X number of Lee Enfield rifles, there you go. Once you take control of that weapon system, of that ammunition, or whatever, you are in charge of it. We're now in an age where that balance of who controls what has shifted dramatically away from the military. And so, with that in mind, my question, I suppose, and it's impossible to an extent because obviously you don't have a crystal ball, but I mean, over, let's say the next 5 years, how do you see that situation playing out in that the corporations you mention are in effect running the show? What's that going to do to warfare, to the militaries that are sort of in the crosshairs?
There's a figure in American history that even a lot of Americans are not familiar with, and the individual's name is Smedley Butler. So Smedley Butler was a 2-star Marine general, served for well over 30 years, and wrote a little booklet that was published, I believe, in 1935, if I remember off the top of my head. But if I'm wrong, it's right around that time period. So the book is 90 years old, and it was called War is a Racket. And interestingly enough, so Smedley Butler, 3 decades of military service, he comes to the realization, this is, prior to World War II, and he comes to the realization that he had been a hired muscle man for the bankers. Well, if we take that same concept and we update it by 90 years, just how much more sophisticated is the racket that Smedley Butler had identified? The other thing that's really interesting about Smedley Butler is he was also approached in the 30s by a group of shady businessmen that actually asked him to basically stir up a spirit of rebellion amongst a bunch of service members and disaffected veterans to overthrow the FDR White House. Now, he ended up blowing the whistle to Congress, and of course he would not go along with it because he was a principled man. But if we take this idea of, well, how powerful were these wealthy businessmen to where they even thought that something like that was possible, and when we just look at how much further we have kind of devolved in 90 years. So there are a couple of things that come to mind as I ponder your question. One, war does not look like the way in which even you and I were kind of taught that war should look when we entered military service. It definitely doesn't look the way in which, pick your favorite military movie. When you think of war, you may kind of think that it looks like that. That's not the way war looks nowadays. It is becoming increasingly more sophisticated, data-driven. And there's a term that I use, which I'm kind of borrowing from Professor Peter Dale Scott and his use of the terms, deep events, deep politics, and of course, deep state, a term that he popularized in the West, but really came from Turkey. And but we are in what I would call a deep war. And what that means is that it's a war that doesn't look the way we think war should look. It's not always kinetic. Kinetic is one of the modalities through which it may be expressed, but there are others. It is increasingly difficult to understand where the battle lines are drawn. It's not always geographically determined, and it's not always determined as, well, this political entity that we call a state versus this political entity that we call a state, kind of the geopolitics model that we learned in high school or in international relations classes and at the university level. It's far more sophisticated than that, and the battle lines are very difficult. And I would say in some ways, it's more that there are these power complexes that are global in nature that are kind of waging war against all the people, and it will sometimes masquerade as war between state A versus state B. But then in essence, there may be something more that is happening in the background. However, one thing that doesn't change is war is largely about the control of resources, and therefore supply or transit routes or other shipping corridors that are used to move resources. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing in and around the Strait of Hormuz right now. But I assume, this is clearly conjecture on my part, what I think is happening in the background is it's not so much a war between Israel and the United States on one hand and Iran on the other, but it's more that you have interests at play. You have, power complexes that can kind of have some degree of influence over both sides. And I think that deals are being made in back rooms. Exactly how those deals are made, I don't know. but then the effect of kind of some of that deal making then plays itself out, and that's what we see. And then heads of state try and explain what's happening in a way that their citizens will bite off on. And so I think that that's what we see Trump doing when Trump tries to come to the American people and explain what is happening with Iran. And the American people have trouble buying it, because what we've seen recently is with these supposed deals with Iran is they're on again, off again. So is there a war? Is there not a war? Do we have a deal with Iran? If we do have a deal, what are the actual tenets of the deal? Because in the United States, we hear one thing, the Iranian media says something else. Israel may say something totally different from either of those two. And I think, unfortunately, this is probably the way that it's going to continue to be, is it's going to become murkier and murkier as to what exactly is happening. How do we find the truth? Statements will be made by heads of state. And some of those, the real reason why those statements are made is because it's done deliberately to cause some sort of fluctuation in the market. I think that's a huge part of what we're seeing as well. So more than that, it's kind of difficult to say, but this is where I would say for Americans or for those in UK or other places that are just kind of watching what's happening, we should always kind of approach this stuff with some skepticism, of course, as to what we're being told and why, but B, even what we're seeing. I mean, we are now in a day and age where, you can't even trust your lying eyes, because if you see it on the news or you see supposed footage, there's just no way to know that what you're seeing represents some sort of reality on the ground.
Very true. I certainly can't disagree with any of that, and I think that's sound advice. And also, as conjecture goes, I'd say that's pretty bulletproof. Now, we are a bit short of time, but I don't want to let you go before you explain where you are and why you're there, because what the UK column audience loves more than anything else is to hear about somebody who's actually doing something. Now tell us what you're up to.
Yeah, so I am currently in Ohio, and I am here for an event that will take place tomorrow night, so the evening of June 30th. And that is for the viewing of a documentary that is called Duty to Disobey. And it was produced on the one hand, by Children's Health Defense, which some of your audience may be aware of, and then the Tommy Burrows production company. And so the documentary tells the story of exactly how we kind of opened our discussion. So it tells the story of service members that were impacted by the COVID shot mandate. And in fact, that's where the title of the documentary comes from, Duty to Disobey. It kind of harkens back to this idea that, yes, you do have a duty to disobey unlawful orders. So this documentary can be seen by anybody who wants to see it. We're going to have viewings all over the U.S. tomorrow night. But it can also be viewed online. So anybody can go to dutytodisobeyfilm.com and can learn more about the documentary. So dutytodisobeyfilm.com. But I appreciate you asking about that.
Yeah, okay. But just one more thing, because just talk about the military chapter, the Children's Health Defense. Just tell us a little bit about that.
So how did somebody like me who doesn't, I'm not married, I don't even have children. How did I get linked up with Children's Health Defense? Well, people who are familiar with the organization, and if you're not familiar with it at all, you can simply go to the website at children'shealthdefense.org. But they have become a recognized leader in education, primarily for parents or others, about risks associated with vaccines. That's kind of how Children's Health Defense kind of made a name for itself over the last couple of years. Well, service members were a particularly disaffected group of individuals that were looking to inform themselves about specifically the COVID shots. And as people were looking for information, a lot of them came across CHD, which was providing a lot of good information in late 2020, early 2021, et cetera. And so there arose this need for CHD to be able to cater specifically to military needs that are a little bit different than maybe parents who are trying to educate themselves about whether or not to vaccinate their children. And so CHD is comprised of a bunch of different geographically aligned chapters inside the U.S., but also outside the U.S. But in 2023, we actually launched a military chapter. I'm one of the individuals who just, in my own capacity, just as a volunteer, I assisted in the launch of that chapter and remain in a capacity to help them along the way. And so, the military chapter, if people want to find out more about the military chapter specifically, you can just go to mil.childrenshealthdefense.org. The page for the military chapter will come right up. But so the military chapter had this idea a while back to potentially do a documentary. Well, why a documentary now that would come out in the summer of 2026? Would people care about it? Is this issue still important? And here's the thing. Well, it is important, and it's important because unfortunately, a lot of people, I see this in the US, but it's probably the same there. A lot of people have kind of started to forget the tyranny that we lived through just a couple of years ago. It's been shocking to me. And if there's a message that I want people to take, not just from this documentary, but just in general, we're not through this. Unfortunately, the COVID operation was not a one-off. We don't know what they're going to plan next. Maybe it won't look exactly like the COVID operation, which didn't look exactly like 9/11 or other operations they have performed, throughout history around the world. But they're not done. They're not done trying to strip resources away from us. And we do see elements of technocracy that are being built, all around the world. And so it's important for us to kind of understand, hey, this is still ongoing. Like, let's not forget the lessons that we learned just 5 or 6 years ago. And let's continue to build and let's continue to look out for each other and also to promote resources that will help other people kind of understand the bigger picture of what's happening.
I think you're absolutely bang on, and I'm afraid to say I completely agree with you with regard to the warning issued. Brad, now tell me, where can people follow what you do and what you write and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, thanks. So the easiest places to find me are my Twitter or X account. My handle is @BradMiller1010. So @BradMiller1010. You can find me at Substack. It's just bradmiller10.substack.com. And if you go on YouTube, and I think if you search on YouTube @BradMiller10, I think my channel will come up. So I do try to, I have a day job and I'm pretty busy, but I try to find time to do things like this, just my volunteer capacity, but also where I can find time. I'm fairly active on X, but also in writing on Substack or in making videos when I feel like I have something that maybe somebody needs to hear, or I don't know. Maybe I'm just talking to myself sometimes, but I like to get out there and just share my thoughts when I can.
Good. Okay, and there'll be links to all the things that you've mentioned accompanying this interview. Brad Miller, it has been a roller coaster and a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, and I hope we'll speak again.
Charles, thank you. Really appreciate it. I appreciate the really good questions.
Thanks for watching to the end of the video. If you got value from it, consider joining as a channel member, which directly supports what we do here. The link is below, and if you're hungry for more, here are 2 more videos for you, and we'll see you in the next one.